Well, hello, welcome, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and joining us for our very latest Oceanographic Roundtable discussion. After a brief hiatus last week, owing to bank holidays and half terms, we are back with the very latest in our ongoing series of Oceanographic Roundtable events. And it's lovely to have such a robust number of you joining us this afternoon for it. Thank you to those of you who have stuck with us for all 10 previous editions. I know there are some regulars, so big shout out to Susan and to Charlie for keeping the audience questions interesting each and every week. And welcome to those of you who are just joining us now, leaving the only question being, where have you been all of this time? Never mind though, because all of our previous roundtable discussions so far are available to watch back on demand via the Oceanographic website or to enjoy in podcast format across both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. These roundtable discussions are a chance each week for oceanographic audiences around the globe to join us as we dissect and dive into some of the biggest headlines across the ocean news and ocean storytelling space. Now, already in this series of live discussions, we have tackled the topics of the UK sewage crisis, the effectiveness of marine protected areas, the pervasiveness of microplastics, and latterly, the critical issue of fin whaling in Iceland and the severe overfishing crisis here in UK waters. Recently, I did manage to get a positive news story across the line as we dissected Sussex's near-shore trawling bylaw. This week, however, it's back to the grindstone as we tackle the biggest and one of the most pervasive issues impacting not just the ocean, but the world we inhabit. Because this afternoon, we are taking on the topic of forever chemicals, PFAS, and a recent study that has found traces of these chemicals in marine life across the Solent here in the UK. It is indeed a big issue, so here's a bit of background on the story so far. So today's roundtable centres on a study just published by researchers at the University of Portsmouth in partnership with the Marine Conservation Society, with serious implications for our coastlines, our wildlife, and the way we regulate chemical pollution in this country. To understand why this research matters, we first need to understand what PFAS are. Per and polyfluoroalkyl, I'm going to need some correction on how I pronounce that, substances. These substances are a family of nearly 15,000 synthetic chemicals that have been in common industrial use since the 1950s. You will find them in non-stick cookware, waterproof clothing, food packaging, and firefighting foams. What makes them so alarming, however, is that they is embedded in their nickname, forever chemicals. They do not, in fact, break down in a natural environment. Instead, they accumulate in soil, in water, and in the tissues of living organisms. The longer an animal lives, or the higher it sits in the food chain, the greater the concentration of PFAS it is likely to carry. The study mapped this contamination across the Solent, a stretch of water separating Hampshire from the Isle of Wight, including within legally protected conservation sites. Researchers analysed government data, water utility records, and their own field samples across more than a dozen species. Some samples revealed pollution levels 13 times higher than the safe threshold for coastal waters. Others technically fell below legal limits for individual substances, but failed safety tests because of their combined toxicity. Most strikingly, harbour porpoises showed the highest concentrations of any species tested, with toxic buildup in their liver tissue far exceeding ecological safety thresholds. The source of this contamination has been traced to treated effluent discharge from wastewater plants in Portsmouth and Fareham, operated by Southern Water. Now, it would be tempting to place all of the blame on the water company, but the picture is actually a little more complicated than that. Southern Water has acknowledged that tackling these chemicals is a challenge for society as a whole. And the lead researcher, Professor Alex Ford, agrees, noting that water companies do not currently have the capacity to filter PFAS from treated effluent. And that is precisely why the research team is calling for these chemicals to be banned at source before they ever enter the water system itself. Which brings us to why we are here today. The government announced the PFAS strategy earlier this year, but it has drawn criticism from environmental groups for lacking decisive action. And the Marine Conservation Society is urging ministers to move faster. And so this roundtable is our opportunity to examine the evidence, to ask what adequate regulation would actually look like, and to consider what each of our sectors, science, policy, industry, and civil society, must do in response to a contamination challenge that has been building for decades. So to join me in tackling this topic, we have a panel of expert guest speakers. So let's welcome them to the stage. And we'll start with Sian Sutherland. Sian is an award-winning entrepreneur, environmental campaigner, and co-founder of A Plastic Planet, the global social impact organization dedicated to reducing the world's dependence on single-use plastics. Since launching A Plastic Planet in 2017, Sian has become a leading voice in the movement to turn off the plastic tap, working with governments, businesses, retailers, and international organizations to accelerate the transition to plastic-free solutions. Hello, Sian.
Hello there, lovely to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to learning more from you and gathering your perspective on this conversation. We are also joined by Callum Duncan. Callum Duncan is Head of Policy and Advocacy at the Marine Conservation Society, the UK's leading ocean conservation charity. A respected marine conservation specialist with more than 2 decades of experience, he has played a leading role in shaping marine protection and recovery policies across Scotland and the wider UK. Throughout his career, Callum has worked closely with governments, environmental organisations, coastal communities and industry to advance evidence-based solutions that restore marine ecosystems, improve fisheries management and strengthen the protection of marine habitats and species. Callum, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this conversation as well.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me in. Good afternoon to everybody.
Great, good to have you. Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Shubhi Sharma. Dr. Shubhi Sharma is a scientific researcher at ChemTrust, where she works at the intersection of science, policy, and environmental protection, translating complex research on hazardous chemicals into evidence-based policy recommendations. Her work focuses particularly on persistent and toxic substances such as PFAS or forever chemicals, supporting efforts to strengthen chemical regulation and promote safer alternatives across the UK and Europe. Dr. Shubhi Sharma, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us this afternoon as well.
Thank you for inviting me. Lovely to be here.
Great. And finally, we have none other than Professor Joanne Preston. Professor Joanne Preston is Professor of Marine Biology at the University of Portsmouth and a leading expert in coastal restoration ecology. Based at the Institute of Marine Sciences, she leads research into the biodiversity, connectivity, and ecosystems functions of temperate coastal habitats, including oyster reefs, seagrass meadows, and salt marshes, with a focus on advancing effective restoration at seascape scale. Joanne is scientific monitoring lead for the Solent Seascape project, the UK's pioneering large-scale marine habitat restoration initiative, where she oversees the scientific programme measuring biodiversity recovery, carbon storage, water quality improvements, and ecosystem connectivity. Joanne, thank you firstly for joining us as well this afternoon.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you here. Thank you so much. I'm going to take a breather. Thank you, all of you, for joining us here this afternoon for this discussion. I'm deeply honoured to be joined by each of you. I am, by the way, Rob Hutchins, community editor here at Oceanographic. And my role this afternoon will be to ask all of the questions. Now, as with all of our roundtable discussions, this is a chance for those of you tuning in, wherever you are, to ask your questions and be a part of the conversation too. So please don't be shy and post those questions into the chat, and I will endeavour to get those asked for you over the course of the next 32 minutes of discussion. But that's definitely enough for me for the time being. So let's hear from each of our experts, and let's start with a word from each of you. And perhaps we start with yourself, Sian, as we dive into this topic then. So we hear the term forever chemicals more and more often, but many people still don't fully understand what PFAS are. Starting with you, Sian, could you sort of give us, from your perspective, why do PFAS matter? Why does this conversation right now matter?
I think it's just the tip of the iceberg that we've become very conscious of most recently. And it is one family of chemicals that, as you've laid out very clearly, are absolutely prevalent in our environment, in our bodies, everywhere. And they have, they've got this very clever little moniker of forever chemicals. So instantly when you say to people, do you know about PFAS? Have you heard about forever chemicals? You can see the general public thinking, well, they don't sound good. And they're absolutely right. But there are so many other chemicals that we should also be concerned about, and I'm sure we'll come on to those later. But PFAS are omnipresent because they are so useful to us. They waterproof things. So you use them on textiles so that they become water resistant and stain resistant. And some of us are old enough to remember when you didn't have those materials, those qualities in a material. You didn't have all this drip dry, stain resistant, fully waterproof, technical clothing, as we call it. It's also used in cosmetics. So we don't really think about this. But PFAS are in cosmetics, and obviously your skin is a permeable membrane. You know, it's the largest detoxification organ of the body. And if we're applying forever chemicals, PFAS, toxic chemicals direct onto our skin in the form of makeup, then that's the problem. And then in your kitchen, you will find them everywhere. Anybody who wants to immediately throw out anything black in their kitchen, anything non-stick, they're making a good move to really eradicate some PFAS exposure, because that's a very well-known use of the PFAS chemicals. And then, of course, we have packaging. And packaging, which is, again, omnipresent in our lives. You look at, you know, the massive amount of plastic we make every single year. 40% of that plastic is used just to make packaging. And PFAS are found in packaging. So when you're buying your little cardboard takeout from wherever, from your takeaway lunch store, or you're getting something delivered by Deliveroo, you can be pretty sure that there is a lining in that what looks like craft paper container, and that lining most of the time will contain PFAS, because it's giving it stain resistant, grease proof, water resistance, all the qualities that paper alone is not going to give us. So this is where you can find PFAS. And so now you start to understand why they have invaded our lives and therefore invaded our environment, particularly our marine environment, and also our bodies.
Mm. Oh, thank you so much for that comprehensive overview of PFAS there, and to actually turn attention to you, Dr. Shubhi Sharma. Perhaps you can give us a bit of a contextualize this for us and explain to us what makes PFAS different from other pollutants and why scientists are increasingly concerned about their presence in our environment.
Yeah. So just to add to what, the very comprehensive explanation that Sean has already given. So the reason that PFAS are so problematic is because of the extreme persistence of these chemicals. Mm-hmm. So we know that there are about 10,000 PFAS chemicals. There are some definitions which say that there are about 15,000 of them. But what we know is that all 10,000 of these PFAS are extremely persistent, which means that once they are in the environment, they're in the environment, and it's, I would say, if not impossible, then extremely difficult to destroy these chemicals. And once they enter the environment, then they are in the cycle. So they'll fall when the rain falls, and they'll be in the drinking water, they'll be in the food that you consume, they'll be in the air that you breathe. And it's because of this persistence that they also tend to accumulate in the body. And because they accumulate in the body, then they, at least some of them, have been linked to severe health impacts, for instance, certain types of cancer, certain types of immunotoxic effects, reprotoxic effects. So that's the main issue with PFAS that we are facing at the moment. And the PFAS pollution problem in the UK is quite unprecedented, but I'm sure we can come back to that later on. But that's just a very preliminary explanation of why PFAS are such dangerous chemicals.
Of course, and thank you for that as well. And just to stay with you just for a second, Shubhi, could you just tell us about some of the most significant sources of PFAS, the sources that they're entering waterways and coastal environments in the UK?
Well, we at the moment in the UK we have one PFAS manufacturing a plant which is near Thornton Cleveleys, and then we also have another huge PFAS pollution hotspot which is in Bentham. So firefighting foams, for instance, are a huge source of PFAS pollution, but also other industrial applications. For example, the production of the non-stick coating on your frying pan, that can be basically a huge source of PFAS pollution in industrial areas. But it's not just about the manufactured in the UK, but even if they're being produced in China, they would end up being in the UK because they are such mobile chemicals. So it doesn't really matter that PFAS are being or not being produced in the UK. It is a global issue. It doesn't really matter where they're being produced. They're going to be traveling all across the world. So we have found PFAS in the Arctic. Nobody's producing PFAS in the Arctic. So that's the scale of the problem that we're facing at the moment.
Yeah, that's crazy. That really does put that in perspective, that scale. Thank you for talking us through that. To turn to you, Joanne, and by way of introduction, so from your monitoring work in the Solent, what do we know about the presence and the impacts of PFAS on marine ecosystems and habitats then, such as the seagrass meadows or the oyster reefs, or indeed the salt marshes?
Well, we actually know very little at the moment, and this is one of the issues. We've got this hugely persistent and contaminant that we don't really understand the full impacts of. So obviously I wasn't one of the authorships on the paper. It was done by Professor Ford and his PhD student and others. And what they were really looking to see is just take a selection of organisms across the food web that sort of represented different places in the food web, the ones that live in the sediment, the ones that eat the ones in the sediment, the fish, and going up. And the most of the studies to date have been on the effects of oysters. Because, obviously a lot of people eat oysters. They're a good model organism, a bit like mussels. And because they sit and filter the water, it's those sort of species that are very likely to bioaccumulate contaminants. However, although there has been some impacts on oyster biology and health, it's also known that if you depurate an oyster, it will clear a lot of the contaminants from the tissues as well. So at the moment, we don't really know the full impact. The impact on plants is not well known at all. The interactions with the botany of seagrass or salt marsh. But what is likely to affect is the biota living on it. Very little work has been done on the microbiology, the sort of bacteria within the system. And that's very little known about that as well. So I think at the moment, we're understanding the hazard, like the level of exposure. But what the risk of that exposure is, we're still waiting to know. And that's when more studies need to be done to find out the impacts on ecosystems. Very little work has been done on the ecosystem level, let alone many of the biological components of our coastal seas.
Interesting. That may make this next question a little bit tricky in that case then, but I'm just going to ask you then, are there any particular species or habitats that you're most concerned about when it comes to long-term chemical contamination?
Yeah, and I think the important thing is PFAS, this is something that Sian was saying earlier, PFAS is one of the many, many pressures that face our marine environment. And I think it comes back to the same issue, is that we think we can throw things away. We think there is an away place. There is no away place. Everything ends up in the sea. And I think the key thing about coastal environments is we've destroyed almost most of them. And so the functioning of our coastal systems are hanging on by a thread. And I think that if I say which ones I worry about the most, maybe those that are filter fielding, but they're really good at getting rid of contaminants. But as it builds up on the food web and as it accumulates, then you're really hitting the resilience of a system that's already crumbling. There's not only the PFAS, there's the eutrophication, too many nutrients, there's not enough light, there's not enough oxygen, and we're overfishing. So there's lots of things that are combining. So I think the key thing is a greater understanding that our dependence as humans is on a healthy, balanced coastal ecosystems that has a range of different habitats, because they're all connected. So I think that, oysters will be able to cope with the PFAS. We can depurate them. What they can't cope with being overfished to the point of collapse. And so we really have to sort of realize that this is one of many multifaceted issues. And it's great that it brings awareness about what we're doing to our coasts and seas, but it needs to be seen as an entry point to a fuller understanding, I think.
Oh, thank you for that, because you're absolutely right. It does. This is one of many sort of pressures and growing pressures that the marine space is facing. So to turn to you, Callum, then, and from a marine conservation perspective, how does PFAS pollution fit alongside the other pressures that facing our ocean right now, such as climate change, overfishing, everything that Joanne's been mentioned there? Could you give us an overview from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been delighted to work with Professor Ford and his team to fund this research, and my colleague Francesca. And because, for the reasons we've heard, we know how persistent these chemicals are. So in a way, the results are not a surprise. They're a great concern, but they're not a surprise. These are persistent, so you would imagine that they would be found throughout the ecosystem, from sediment through seaweed, invertebrates, fish, right up to harbour porpoise. So we're whilst obviously it's a really concerning issue, we're pleased to have helped add to the the evidence base and to take that story to the heart of legislatures across the UK to highlight the problem. To answer your question about how it fits in, interestingly, it sounds like you've had a previous session looking at sewage impacts, and for us, this is the sort of invisible component on that. It's just part of the sewage is not the only source, although, as you mentioned, the research has found the treatment works in the Solent were a source of these PFAS because they don't remove them. So this is another facet of the sewage crisis as well, although there are lots of other sources, as we've heard from Shan, Shubi, and Joanne. So it's what we find when we're talking to people on the beach. Obviously, the macroplastic and even some of the visible microplastic, people can grasp that, they can see it, and that is a huge concern. We need to encourage a circular economy. We need to stop plastic getting into the sea. We need to look at how plastic is manufactured to limit some of the chemical pollution, including PFAS, that arises from plastic manufacturing. But from our perspective, we're just, in our conversations at the beach, when we do our citizen science surveys with people coming in to help out, it's just another worrying but key part of the story that we're telling people about how we're impacting the ocean. But it's important that people don't feel overwhelmed by that. And I think in the past, whether it's on litter or plastic, but right the way through to invisible chemicals, where the onus, as manufacturers have often sought to put the onus on people and behavior change. So when we were having those conversations, we started that with the plastic crisis a few years ago, or when that became prominent. Obviously, plastic crisis has been going on for years. A big part of what we're doing is seeking to flip that narrative in our advocacy. This is about these are damaging compounds. They should be stopped at source. Regulation should be follow the evidence. The evidence is clear that we can't take a chemical by chemical approach. Yes, PFOS has been banned, but we can't go through the other 9,999 plus that should be mentioned to analyze each of them. We should take a grouped approach, and that's where we're really looking to the EU, where they're taking that more precautionary approach. So we would really be urging. We're in the heart of the Parliament's urging this this approach. We look at restricting these as a group. We want to start with the consumer products first, but we'd like to see a universal restriction by 2030. So it's just part of the ocean crisis that Joanne was talking about, and a big part of the job that we do is highlighting the reliance that we have on the ocean every second breath we take, the well-being it brings, and it's another thread to that story. But we have to provide hope with that. But I think the hope comes with how logical it is, with the evidence growing, including with this study, to say, we shouldn't be putting this stuff out. We did sensible things in the past with PCBs decades ago. This is our generation's PCBs. We need to restrict them.
Absolutely. Thanks, Callum. As predictably, the questions are flying in from all our engaged audience, which is great. And so we're going to try and come to those. And obviously, there's you've mentioned their policy, consumer behaviours. We're going to dive into all of those topics. But I think we just want to get the one that's probably on most people's minds or lips when they heard that the finding these chemical traces in the Solent is the question of if these chemicals are widespread throughout the marine food web, what does that mean for local seafood safety and human health? Who feels like they want to sort of field that question? Joanne, I feel that maybe you're in.
Yeah, I can start. I think, of course, it's a huge concern. We're told all the time what we can and cannot eat. You know, you think everywhere you turn, you're eating the wrong thing or the right things. I think the important thing to remember about this study, it was only really in the porpoise that there was very high levels of concentration in the liver, where you're likely to get things concentrated, because that's what our liver does. It detoxes things. And so it's sort of putting the biological and ecological context into these findings. And there was obviously levels of PFAS in most of the biota, but most of the biota weren't above those biotic levels on a single level, although the sort of compounding effect can have toxicity. And that's a really important point that I think that Shubi will be able to talk to much more eloquent than me. But I do think it is that idea that as they accumulate across the food web, when we eat these higher organisms, the fish, the mackerel, everything else, the oily fish particularly maybe, that you're going to be consuming these, just like you can't have too much tuna and oily fish sometimes because of the mercury in it, the concentrations. And so I think it's so important that studies like this raise awareness about what is in our food and why. And so we are informed, and that's really important. I think that in many low trophic aquaculture, there's lots of depuration that can happen. So the food becomes safe by being fed in clean water. That's very effective. So I think it does have implications for seafood safety. I think I want to go back to what Duncan said. You know, it's very easy to lay the blame at the water companies, but there's many pathways of these substances that get into the water before that water gets to the water company. So it definitely is a societal problem, and that's where policy is so important. Like, do we think we should allow society to produce these chemicals? What is the cost benefit analysis to us immediately, and then the later cost to us through the environmental and detrimental impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And just to turn to you quickly, Callum, I know that these are the foibles of having two first names. So we are, of course, joined by Callum Duncan from Marine Conservation Society. I made the mistake of saying the second name first earlier. Yes. When we talk about stemming these at the source, then, Sian, I'd just like to turn to you and ask you about the businesses who often argue that PFAS are difficult to replace because of their performance benefits. Have you seen examples of companies successfully transitioning away from these chemicals? And then what lessons can be learned from those?
I think when the world woke up to the plastic crisis, so if we go back to 2018 and David Attenborough and Blue Planet 2 and everything that's been discussed so many times about that wake up moment for the world. And every single industry, every business stood on their little soapbox and they had a plastic pledge, pact, promise of some kind. 2025 was a absolute deadline with reduction, a primary reduction in the use of virgin plastic for most of them. And then obviously the use of recycler and other things. Not a single one of them succeeded. Every single one of them, one by one, starting with Unilever, caved and announced, actually, we're not going to hit our deadlines. We're definitely not going to cut plastic at the level that we said that we would. And that proves that it is impossible. In fact, I'm wrong. There was one company, and that's Apple. And they managed to eradicate all plastic out of their packaging. But they're the only one globally. Every single other one has failed, which proves that voluntary doesn't work. It is impossible for businesses. Their entire business model, their supply chain, their product, it is wedded to plastic. And when I say plastic, I'm not talking about a primary material. I'm talking about a blend of chemicals, many of them toxic and many of them being PFAS and endocrine disrupting chemicals. These families of chemicals that we fight against right now. So I don't know any CEO in the world that is brave enough to step forward and say to their stakeholders, their shareholders, we're going to take a short-term hit on profits to do the right thing by the ocean, by the environment, by human health. Mm-hmm. Nobody's brave enough to do it. I understand why, because then they'll be out of a job. And then somebody who will just look after shareholder value, the share price, will step in their place. We have to have policy. And this is where the UK are really just dragging their heels behind the EU. We talk about, let's just follow what the EU are doing. We had this whole thing with Brexit of, oh, we're going to have freedom to do what we want and become a leader in policy. And actually all we're doing around chemicals is water down what the EU are trying to do. I think as the general public, we need a wake up. And perhaps PFAS is part of that wake up. And the wake up is we vote governments in to protect us, to run the systems that we all adhere to. But fundamentally, they are there to protect us, and they are not doing so. They are in full to the fossil fuel industry, the petrochemical industry, and we need to all be a little bit more vocal about this. It's very easy to be overwhelmed and think there's nothing I can do. I'm breathing it, I'm drinking it, I'm eating it. Our babies are born pre-polluted now. It's very easy to feel defeated. And I think we need to say no. And we need to step up in bigger numbers and follow the science, because the science is there, and actually take some action about this, because governments are not showing the leadership that we need.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And since the science is there, as you correctly stated, let's turn to that science. Let's turn to you, Shubi, and then to ask you about the given the sheer number of these PFAS chemicals that are in use, what's your perspective on the current testing and regulatory systems? Can they keep pace with the emerging risks? And then to tap onto that, how do we avoid repeating the cycle of just replacing one harmful chemical with another?
I think this touches on what Sean was already saying about making sure that the regulator, we're not doing single chemical by chemical analysis, and that we're actually banning them as a group. So I think what the EU has done in this respect, the Universal PFAS regulation, which basically is a proposal to regulate all 10,000 of them as a group, is quite a good step forward in that direction, because what we have seen in the past is that, and Callum was also sharing this before, we have banned PFAS and before, but then what actually ended up happening is that we managed to replace PFAS and PFOA with, if not equally harmful, then maybe shorter chain PFAS. So I think what really needs to happen is that the UK needs to align with what the EU is doing and really bring forward this comprehensive restriction, which is not regulating these PFAS one by one, but rather, controlling them as a group. And what the EU has shown is that that's absolutely, definitely possible. So just recently, the EU's chemicals agency, the two scientific committees, which are RAC and SEAC, the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee, they've come back with their analysis. They've done like a 3-year thorough analysis of this proposal to regulate all these 10,000 PFAS. And what they say is that it's actually possible to regulate all 10,000 of them in a way that it's not catastrophic for the society. And just going back to the question that Sean addressed before about alternatives, what these scientific committees have found is that there is actually a booming innovative industry of PFAS alternatives, even in the most so-called critical sectors like the medical sector, in the aerospace sector, where the industry or some parts of the industry like to complain that if PFAS were banned, then the planes would start falling from the sky, or that people would start dying because they wouldn't have PFAS in their pacemakers. So what's really important to understand here is that, yes, there might be some really, really critical uses where PFAS might be necessary. For instance, we don't want, if it's necessary in a pacemaker, we don't want people to die without that pacemaker. But what these scientific committees have shown is that there is a booming industry of alternatives which is up and coming, and there are industries which are making this effort of creating these alternatives in even the most critical sectors. And what they've done is they have proposed a very pragmatic way of phasing out PFAS from the society so that it's not critical for the economy, while also it's very beneficial for the environment. So the UK lacks a similar sort of a vision, like Sean was saying before. And what we have to do at the moment is that we have to align with the EU and follow in line with what the EU is doing in terms of doing this source control, phasing them out as a group, while making sure that the society does not get harmed by their phasing out.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shubi. And just seen a question come in from Ruth, and I think it's quite an interesting one, so I'm going to ask this one. And I think we're going to turn this one to yourself, Callum, because I believe you mentioned CFCs earlier on in the discussion. But would we be able to use a similar structure to the legislation that banned the global use of CFCs with the restriction of use of PFAS?
Who you're
Yeah,
asking? Oh, right.
Sorry, just say I completely agree with everything Shannon and Shubi were saying there. I was mentioning PCBs, all the acronyms.
That's right. Yeah, sorry, got my acronyms.
That's all right. Similarly as Joanne was talking about, they bioaccumulate up the food web and concentrate in the blubber of marine mammals and get released when they're feeding the young, or food sources are low and they get a hit, which can damage them. But international frameworks are important. We supported PFAS being added to the Stockholm Convention in May 2025, for example. So, we need, I don't know the ins and outs of the Montreal Protocol, but they're mentioned in they've been added to the Stockholm Protocol. We've seen as a bloc, and as we just touched on, the EU looking at that more strategic, precautionary, grouped approach. And I can only reiterate that we would want the UK to keep pace with that. So that international leadership and international recognition is always important, whether it's climate change, biodiversity, CFCs, PCBs, plastics. Notwithstanding the frustrations, won't get into that with plastics, and that fell through last year. But we need to keep pushing at all levels, globally, nationally, and with trading blocs like the EU for sense to prevail. But that can be done in a sensible way, as Shubi has said. And I would just finish by saying, on the industry and the economic side, there's Planet Tracker did a study of 1,000 companies, and over half of them were exposed to financial risk by having PFAS in their products and supply chains. So there is always, we need to keep pushing on that economic side of things as well. I believe 3M were hit with a $10 billion lawsuit in 2023, for example. So it's just about getting these messages to every layer of sort of governance and regulation, and to keep pushing away. But as Shubi said, human progress, however we want to define that, is all about innovation. If we didn't innovate away from damaging things, we look at all the practices that we've stopped already, because we know that they'll be damaging once the evidence has come in, and it's not going quick enough. But we just need to keep pushing.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that, Callum. My spidey senses were tingling throughout that, because I could see you all nodding your heads rigorously in agreement throughout what Callum was describing there. So maybe in order of how I saw those heads nod, should we start with you, Sian? And I think it was on the point of innovation.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, we're very focused on promoting the innovators, because it's not good enough in my book as an entrepreneur to back industry into a corner with guilt and blame of everything that they're doing wrong in the name of profit, but then not help them with solutions. And there is a narrative that there is only plastic, that there's only these toxic chemicals that will give us the lives, the products that we need for the lifestyles that we love. And that narrative we have to push against. So we do a lot of work with the innovators. And what is so clear is, when you ban things, industry have certainty. And if you give industry certainty, they will innovate. But when we have this lack of certainty, so lack of policy guidance and governance, strong governance, then industry are not going to invest in R&D. And I see these fledgling innovators who are creating safe for nature, safe for the ocean, safe for humans, new materials that could easily be scaled up. They just need attention and investment. And they struggle with their fundraising because there is no imperative for business to change. And there are two reasons that the industry will change. And one is the law. And if we create the right policy, then there's a level playing field for all of industry. They can shift as one. and no sea to fear. And the other is risk. And some of the other panelists have already mentioned this, that when we're talking about risk, I think when industries start to wake up, and governments, to this contingent liability they should be reporting on their balance sheets if they continue to pump out toxic materials, toxic chemicals, with decades of irrefutable peer-reviewed evidence that they are causing harm to everything on our planet. And the risk is, we could easily be leading to class actions. We all saw dark waters. We've already talked about 3M. I think law is going to be on the side of the injured here. Mm-hmm. And industry need to be very aware that if they don't shift, they will be forced to shift either by policy or by the fact they're going to get sued.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And yeah, no stronger signal than that, surely.
Yeah.
And actually that leads into this question or statement from Mel, and I'm gonna lean onto this one because I think this does set us up nicely for a bit of a short discussion on communications and staying hopeful. But it's this one from Mel: that industry simply runs government. The amount of plastics we have in our beaches is overwhelming and still building. Our government simply goes along with this. So at 74, I have decided to stop trying to clean up and walk away. Our beaches have feet of beat up plastics, have to defeat beat up plastics that are there. To say, what else can we do? Okay, well, I think the overriding message there is, how can we firstly communicate that there is hope, that there is, how do we communicate the urgency of this whilst remaining hopeful? And then what is keeping us hopeful? And I'm going to turn to you, Shubi.
Well, I think, in terms of PFAS, I can speak. So what we've seen is that those PFAS which have been banned, we can see their levels decreasing in the environment. So when we say that they are absolutely impossible to remove from the environment, yes, that's true. But once you stop producing them, their levels tend to go down in the environment. So we do have hope in that sense. And the point here is not to make people anxious. It's about being alert, not being anxious. So there's a difference. And I think what we can do as people is we can write to our MPs. It's such a pivotal moment that we're living in at the moment, where the EU has come out with this this unprecedented regulation which is going to phase out PFAS. It's going to happen sooner or later. So what's really important is that we really speak with our MPs. We go out and we have communication with them, and we really try and explain this almost, even if you're feeling fear in terms of as consumers of being exposed to these chemicals. I think it's really important that we go and speak about this with our with our MPs. And so we do have agency in that sense. So it's not about creating fear, it's not about creating anxiety and panic amongst public, but we have to face a reality, and the reality is that we do have a PFAS pollution crisis in the UK at the moment. There are 10,000 PFAS hotspots, if not more. That could be just the tip of the iceberg. But that does not mean that we cannot solve this problem together. I think human beings, we are creatures which solve problems. I mean, we went to the moon in the 60s. Surely we can solve this problem if we come together and if we put our heads together. And there's a huge community of, people and civil society which are really fighting for this cause. So there is no need for us to feel hopeless and helpless. I think it's just a matter of really making sure that we stay on top of our game, and we continue to advocate for the phase out of these chemicals as a group.
Can I add something to what Shubi has just said?
Absolutely, please do.
Because I really love Mel's comment here about I'm giving up, and part of me applauds her for trying, but says I think you're right, because we need to let it pile up. Because we need to stop making it our responsibility. It is not our responsibility. But if you want to do something, I don't know if people were aware of the national emergency briefing that happened at the end of last year in the UK. And I think it's a really incredible movement. And if you Google national emergency briefing, then if you want to do something, I would host a screening of the film that they made of this national emergency briefing. And the whole point of it was to ensure that our MPs, our elected officials, who are not educated in the poly crisis, they're not educated about the chemical soup that we have created. So we need to create events that educate them very fast. And that's what the NEB was. And they are now hosting these trainings, and they are happening thousands of them across the UK. Every time I look at the screening map, it makes me happy, because I realize that there are so many people out there that care and realize we need to call for action from our governments. And that's the only way that we can do it. So there is a groundswell, but it's a groundswell that isn't taking personal responsibility for this shit show, but is actually laying the responsibility where it deserves to be, and that's on the shoulders of industry and governments. So get involved in that, and that might be a really positive thing to do.
Absolutely.
And by the way, they're doing a whole briefing on toxic chemicals next.
Excellent. That's very good to hear. And there's a pop-up there for the National Emergency Briefing. I was there at the event. It was very inspiring, concerning, but also emboldening and encouraging. All of those things at the same time. So yeah, if the one's in your local area, make sure you go along, or set your own one up. And actually, whilst we're talking about all these wonderful acts of inspiration and action, why don't we talk about the Solent Seascape project itself, Joanne? Because it would be remiss not to talk about some of the amazing things and the way that this is cross communities, the restoration that's going on there, and some of the really positive work that's coming out of it. But I'll let the words out your mouth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I was going to say to Mel and others. It's so easy when you hear all the bad news not to know what the good news is happening. And I work with people across Europe who are passionate and delivering restoration of marine habitats at scale. You know, that's what we're trying to do. There's a nature restoration regulation which has got a bold ambition to recover nature because it realizes we need it. And in the UK, we've got the Environment Improvement Plan with really ambitious targets to restore habitats across coastal, marine and terrestrial. And the Solent Seascape project, it brings across together 10 really key partners that have been working in single habitats for decades mostly, and restoring bird habitats, seagrass, which are sort of underwater, flowering plants, salt marshes, which most people know what a salt marsh is, and oyster reefs, which used to be abundant across Europe. They used to be our temperate coral reefs, and they are now collapsed. And so part of the things about communicating with people is like how things used to be, so they can have the appropriate excitement, ambition about where we go. And so in the Solent, we're trying, and we will be restoring multiple hectares of these habitats, actively putting them back in, planting seagrass, creating new oyster reefs, recreating new salt marsh, to create these tipping points. Because one of the big ways we can approach this climate and nature crisis is by making nature abundant again. Because the more abundant nature is, the more resilient it is, and more it buffers these things. So that's a really important point. And the other thing that we're doing in the Solent Seascape project, is one of the reasons why I'm here, is we're working with stakeholders across the whole of the region to create a Solent recovery plan. So we've done a state of nature to see how bad it is, and then we're also creating this recovery plan that works with all the statutory council, industry, regulators to try and have a plan going forward that goes beyond the life of the initial 5-year project. And I think that's where the power is coming together. And I do think that you think society always stays the same, but it doesn't. It doesn't often change linearly. There's big step changes, and we are not powerless. And there are many people that are working incredibly hard to make change. But the last thing I'd say is not going to change until we change financial mechanisms and markets, because nearly all of them destroy nature. And until companies are called to account for the ecocide that they've committed, the death of the natural environment, unless that starts becoming on the account books, then that's where we're never really going to change. So I think that is one thing that we're really looking to see how we can input the data to help change financial mechanisms. That's a really important part.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Joanne. And look, just massive congratulations to you and all the teams that's been working across those. Amazing. It really is a wonderful project, the Solent Seascape project. And having spoken to those teams, I know that there's a lot of hard work that goes into it. So big kudos to you for making all that happen. And I do believe that this is a conversation that could go on for another hour or so, but I won't. Before anyone does spit their tea over their screens, we're not going to do that. I'm going to remain mindful of time and start to wrap things up. And just to turn to you, Callum, and to talk about what if you could see one policy come into force tomorrow, what would that be? Or if you were to come back and have this conversation in 5 years' time, what would you like to see that be? What changes would you like to see in that time?
Yeah, big question. I think the policy tomorrow is, the consumer bans in place. I mean, the HSE consulted on the firefighting foam. We know airports can operate with PFAS-free firefighting foams. You know, let's just do that. Commit to phasing it out from consumer products, and then we welcomed the fact that it was a PFAS plan. As you said at the start, yes, you know, disappointment. A lot of it's a plan to have a plan. At least the plan recognised the scale of the issue. But my wish would be for that to trigger urgent action, which actually looked at working towards a universal restriction in 2030. So that would be, you know, a year before coming back in 5 years. And just really, really quickly, I completely agree with what Joanne said, and I was sympathetic with Mel's comments. We have our citizen sciences people out there collecting rubbish on the beach, these visible signs of pollution, and they have supported change that works. And yes, they're just bits of the problem. We need that wider system change. But where we have these interventions, we see cotton buds going down, we see carrier bags going down. We're hoping to get the deposit return scheme. So things don't happen as quick as we'd like. I do have faith that logic will out when the evidence builds. So, 5 years' time, hopefully that sense has prevailed in terms of having that universal restriction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Callum. And we have got a poll going on at the moment as well. And we asked the question, who do you think should be responsible for tackling plastics and PFAS pollution? We asked, is it government, individuals, a combination of these? 50% have voted for government. Well, it's 50-50, 50% gone for the government, 50% gone for a combination. So there you go. No, I am going to remain mindful of time. I know that we could talk for a long time, but then we'd be sat here behind our desks and not going out there and driving positive impacts like I know we all want to. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to say, look, thank you so much for all of your time and for all of your energy and sharing your insights and your expertise over the course of this discussion. And thanks to everyone who's been posting those questions into the chat. And apologies to those that you didn't get round to asking, but you'll have to come back next time and ask questions for the next discussion. If you've enjoyed this roundtable session, be sure to come back next week when we'll tackle next week's biggest story at the same time and the same place. And do check out the Oceanographic platform for the latest details on our live Ocean Talks events, as well as our printed magazine and everything else that we have to offer. So that leaves me with nothing more to add other than have wonderful evenings, everybody. Thank you again for all of your time and energy, and see you next time.
Cheers. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.